Good day. I'm Vincent Saxtetter, and this is the After the Age of Fire channel. This is episode 30, recorded February 7th, 2026, about how to get the best harvest from our land. Right now, we get about 15,000 calories of food, fodder, and wood from our land worldwide. That's 15,000 calories per person, averaged across the whole human race per day. And so, this episode will be about how we could possibly get more than 15,000 calories of food, fodder, and wood from the per person per day from the globe. In the previous episode, I talked about how our harvest goes now and why we aren't getting the best from our land. In this episode, we'll do the other side, how we could do better. Um, and this is a prepping channel. After the Age of Fire is a prepping channel. Right now, we get about 46,000 calories from coal, oil, and gas, and a small fraction of that is from other sources, the ones that we call renewables. But almost all of that is coal, oil, and gas. So 46,000 calories plus the 15,000 calories of food, fodder, and wood. And this is actually our supply from coal, oil, and gas has been doubling roughly every 22 years for the last 250 years. And not just coal, oil, and gas, all our consumption of just about everything has been doubling. Um, so each generation could expect to have around twice as much as their parents did. And so the first section of this content, we're coming close to the end of that section, has been looking over how that growth has gone and then examining how much we can expect to have long term, whether we can continue to have the 46,000 calories plus 15,000 or whether we'll have more or less. And well, we've looked at coal, oil, and gas, and sometime soon we'll hit a peak in our total energy supply soon, maybe first oil will hit its peak, and then uh, and then gas, and then coal. But within 100 to 200 years, we'll certainly not be supplying 46,000 calories or 40,000. Right now, we're getting around 41,000 from coal, oil, and gas. We won't be supplying that amount to ourselves unless we're willing to make a radical change in our lifestyle and start sending armies underground into the coal mines again and things like that. So that'll give out. Uh, we'll still have coal and gas, just not as much. And then we looked at the renewables and found that they'll never give us more than even if we spend a lot more money than we are now, they'll never give us more than somewhere around 15,000 calories per person per day. So they can't make up the difference when coal, oil, and gas become harder to obtain. And so the only other option is to get more from food, fodder, and wood. In other words, to grow more in our cropland and our forests. And so that's what we've been looking over for the last 10 episodes or so. And episodes, and so why do we get the amount that we do from our crops in the world's land? And so we looked at um, because the reason why we looked at this was because actually the amount of sunlight arriving on the Earth's surface is around 300 times more than what the world's plants actually harvest, and then we get like 1/11th of that. So why is it only 1 out of 300 calories from the sun get turned into dry plant matter? And we looked at a factor of 20 loss, 1 out of 20. If you put a plant in a nice lab and force feed it, do all sorts of strange things to it, it will capture 1 out of 20 calories, not 1 out of 300. And so we looked at why does it capture only 1 out of 20? And that was in episodes 23 and in episode 23, 24, and up through 28. And then, no, I'm sorry, that was episodes 24 through 28. And then you compare labs to what happens on the world's best farmland, and labs do a factor of 3 better than the world's best farmland. In other words, the world's best farmland only gets 1 out of 60 calories. And why is there that factor of 3? That was episode 23. There's not much we can do about that because we can't turn the world's land all into a big lap. Um, and then lastly, there's a factor of 5 difference between the world's average land and the world's best cropland. And we looked at that in episodes 22, 29, and we're looking at it again now and then in the next episode. And this is where actually the bulk of the improvement of our harvest could come from by giving plants more water and better land, then we could possibly get a better harvest from our plants. Um, so in the previous episode last week, we talked about how we're actually destroying the world's land today, especially destroying the soil, killing the soil, which is usually full of a lot of organisms, and that our farming practices reduce the number of organisms and the number of species in the soil. And then in this episode, instead of talking about what we're doing wrong, I'll talk about what we could do better. And then, but that'll actually require a lot of sacrifice and effort on our part. So next episode, episode 31, I'll dwell on what what we would have to give in order to get a better harvest. Okay. Why is this a prepping channel? Um, this is a prepping channel because pretty soon here we'll be talking about. I mean, we're coming to the end of reviewing our energy supply, and we're going to find that perhaps we could we could expect to have in 100 to 200 years 15,000 calories of food, fodder, and wood plus 15,000 calories of other things, or maybe 15 and 20, but roughly half of the total energy that we have now. Um, and certainly we won't be expanding our energy consumption every 22 years the way that we have been. So sometime around now in the next 30 years, we'll be going through the end of the doubling. So we won't be able to double our consumption anymore, heads will roll literally, because we are used to thinking of our success versus our failure in terms of whether we're actually expanding year on year. Um, so fairly soon I'll be moving into the second part of this channel's content, which will be trying to examine where we are right now and where we stand with respect to the end of exponential growth, and then I'll be moving into material about what the world will be like after the doublings have ended and our energy consumption has gone down a bit, maybe divided by 2, and how you could prepare yourself and your family line to flourish in the next decades and the next century. So it's a prepping channel for a huge change, a change where we've been in an extraordinary time of expansion, and now we're moving into another time where we won't be expanding, not doubling the way that we have been, but we'll still have far more than we did, say, 300, 500 years ago. So how do you prep yourself and your family to thrive in the new era? That's why I'm prepping, and it'll be a far more fundamental change. The wars, the famines, all the mayhem that's going on already and will continue going on all fits in to the bigger storyline. It's all part of the bigger storyline, and I think you'll understand better the mayhem that we're going through and that will increase in the next decades. You'll understand it better once you understand the transition that we're going through between the doubling that we've been doing until recently and the new era that's coming. So with that, I'll get into the content of this episode, which is trying to set a direction towards getting the best harvest from our land. Now, I'll be talking about some specific ideas about how to handle water and what you could do better with water, what you could do better with your land, different farming practices, and so on. But this isn't actually the main point, okay, of this episode. Uh, let's take a step back for a minute and just remind ourselves that there have been billions of people working the world's land for thousands of years. Agriculture started somewhere around 10,000 years, and for most of that time until now, until just the last couple hundred years, almost everyone worked on the land. And people made their wealth from the land. if you weren't actively working yourself with your hands in the land, you were probably a landowner or somebody who were, and you had some work to do. If you got lazy or corrupt, of course, then your life might collapse or your family's life might collapse. But if you wanted yourself and your family to stay up on things, then you would be working with everyone on the land. Um, and so there continue to be billions of people working on the land in many different capacities, farmers and scientists and all sorts of other people. And so how am I going to sum up in one episode a direction in any kind of detail, a real plan per se that does better than all of those other billions of people alive today and alive before me? In fact, that's impossible. I could claim to do that, but I'd just be a liar. Um, so I'm not going to try to outcompete. And I wasn't even brought up as a farmer, and didn't study farming. And so how am I going to? But I can say something about it. I can talk about a general direction that we would need to go in order to get better from our land. So I'll be talking about some specific ideas, but those ideas are meant to just to illustrate some of the things you'll need to think about. And then I'll also be talking about a general direction uh, of movement that we would take, uh, and about the speed and style of our movement uh, as we try to get better from the land. So how fast we go and how fast we can expect our harvest to increase, and the style that we'll be using as we try to increase the harvest. And and lastly, I'll be talking about what sort of increase we could hope for. Just to tell you now, I think possibly in the next century or two, with after a century or two, we could possibly, there's a chance that with intensive effort we could uh, we could double our consumption, our production from food, fodder, and wood from 15,000 to 30,000 calories per person per day. This is, as always in this content, I'm assuming that our population stays constant, um, 8 billion or so, 7.8 billion persons. Um, 7.8 was our population just a few years ago. So anyway, I'm just all my I'm saying, assuming our population remain constant, this is what it we could possibly double our energy per person from the world's land. Then the next episode next week will be about what sort of commitment, what sort of sacrifice we would need to make to get that factor of 2, or to have a chance at that factor of 2. Okay, so I'll go in. First, I'll talk about things we could do about supplying more water to the world's land to get a better harvest, and then I'll talk about what we could do for the land itself. Um, water is easier to talk about, so I'll go through that first. Um, just to remind you why water is important, uh, about for every kilo of dry plant material that the world's plants produce, they need around 600 kilos of water. Um, I explained why a few episodes ago. It's because they have to keep their leaves open to receive air, receive carbon dioxide to turn into carbohydrate. But since their leaves are full of holes, they bleed out water all the time. Um, so and of that, so 600 kilos for 1 kilo of dry plant material, and of that we might get 40%, maybe slightly better than 40%, but not a half of the plant material for our harvest. That's from our best grains. Okay, so I'll be talking here about how we could supply more. What are the options for supplying more water to our plants? Bear in mind as we go that in some parts of the world, the problem is not that there is not a lack of water. The problem is too much water, or sometimes in some seasons, or too much water all year round. So I'm not going to talk about regions with that problem. I'm just going to concentrate on uh, on how to help. In most of the world, growth is limited by not having enough water. So I'm going to because for all the rain that, in fact, the world's plants make very good use of the world's rain and snowfall and so on, as I'll describe in a minute. Um, and if they could get more rain or more snowfall or whatever, they would be able to produce even more. Uh, so there are three options for supplying more water to our plants, to the world's plants. One is to take water that's already moving around in the world's lakes and rivers and move it to farmland so that the plants on the land, in other words, to irrigate. Okay? Irrigate from natural sources. Um, the second option is to take seawater, remove the salt from the seawater, and irrigate using the desalinized salt water. And the third option will be to change our farmland around and our crops around so they make better use of the water they receive. So I'll go through those in order. First, let's talk about the world's water supply and how much water there is, and uh, then I'll talk about how much of that water supply we could use for our farmland. So the world's average water supply is each square meter of the world's land receives on average about 840 kilos or liters of water per year. Um, so you take on average each person has 16,700 square meters of land. If you divided it equally between all of us, um, that would be 840 kilos of water per square meter, or liters of water per square meter, would be 38 tons of, or 38,000 liters of water per person per day that arrives on the world's land. That's a lot of water. And if one person were to collect those 38 tons every day of the year then he could fill up 5 Olympic swimming pools with that water. It's a lot of water, okay? And so let's look at how much of that arrives uh, in the world's rivers and so on, and how much of that we could actually use. So, but first let me mention that 840 kilos of water per square meter, if that were all used by plants, that would give you around 1.4 kilos of dry plant material per square meter of land, and on average the world's land gives us 0.9 kilos of dry plant material per square meter. So 1.4 versus the actual 0.9 tells you that in fact that it's around 50% more than what the world's land actually produces. So all our concern about why the world's plants absorb only 1 out of 300 sunlight calories is actually a little bit off the mark, because it looks like what they're really being limited by is more water than sunlight. Um, it looks like, because the real limit has more to do with just not having enough water. They're using around 2/3 of the water very well. So the 38 tons per person per day of precipitation, rainwater, snow, and so on, um, are already being very well used. So 24 tons of it, 24 out of 38, that's about 2/3, never gets to rivers or lakes. It evaporates first, and most of that is because plants have gotten to it and held it and evaporated it during photosynthesis. Um, so now, out of those 24 tons that are used almost all for photosynthesis, 1/4 are used on our cropland and pastures. So 6 tons of water are being used by our cropland and pastures. So that's 24 tons that never gets to the rivers and lakes or into groundwater, aquifers. That leaves, out of 38 tons, that leaves 14 more tons that do get to lakes, rivers, and go in underground. Okay, so 14 tons remaining. And then out of those 14 tons, 7 tons per person per day are out of our control. Because it comes that 7 tons comes during rainy seasons and storms, times when we're lucky if we just don't get flooded and washed away. So we carefully build dikes and dams to steer the water and to not destroy us and our property. Um, and we're lucky if our dams and dikes don't wash away during these rainy seasons and storms, and we have no opportunity, no possibility of holding that water and harnessing it. We just have to let it go to the sea as fast as it can. So that's 7 tons out of that, about half of the water in the lakes, rivers, and pastures. We just have to let it wash down to the river. That leaves about 7 tons. There's another 3 tons that are inaccessible to us because they're inaccessible. They're in places that we can't get to. There's tundra and taiga up in the Arctic, near the Arctic. There's the Amazon and there's Central Africa. So huge flows of water in areas that we're unable to control. Okay, so we leave out these 2 types of uncontrolled water. The one that the water that that falls during rainy seasons, and the water that's in inaccessible places, and that leaves 4.4 tons remaining per person per day that flows through the rivers and lakes in a way that's accessible and under control. So let me make a point that you might think that we could get more water from in our lakes and our rivers if we would just cut down some forests or make sure that the plants don't capture it. Okay, so we fight the plants so the plants don't use it, don't evaporate it. The world's plants, and so if the world's plants don't evaporate water, then there should be more water in the rivers and in the lakes, so we'd have more water for our own uses. And for the most part, that won't work. I mean, even if it were morally a thing that you could do morally, it won't work very well because we have such problems controlling water when it moves. If you cut down a forest and the water just drains off the land, then you'll just have huge floods and you won't benefit much. So I just wanted to point that out so that you don't go too far along that rabbit hole. So that leaves 4.4 tons out of, remember that there's 38 tons of precipitation per person per day, and out of that 4.4 tons, or just over 10% of that water is in accessible places and under our control. So that's what we have to deal with, and we use about a third of that, 1.6 tons, that we withdraw from the world's lakes and rivers. And groundwater, 1.6 tons withdrawn. We take 1 ton of that water, 1 out of the 1.6 tons, and use that for irrigation. And the other 0.6 tons, 600 liters of water per person per day, is used for other purposes, much of it for industry, but also for your toilets and your cooking and everything else that your house uses water for. So let me point out, so on average, worldwide we have 4.4 tons, and we use about 1/3 of it, leaving about 2/3 in the rivers and lakes. But this is an average, okay? And in many places, there's less water in the rivers and lakes, and there are more people. And so in many places, we remove a much larger fraction of the water, and we drain rivers entirely. And also it can vary a lot from season to season and from year to year, from decade to decade as weather conditions come and go. So even though this 1/3 average that we use 1/3 of the accessible water is not representative of the entire world. In some places we run through all the water, in other places we use less. Okay? And that 1/3 the 1.6 tons that we do remove has a huge impact on the world's rivers, lakes, and wetlands. So all this is coming to the point that how much water could we supply to crops? So we have 4.4, well, the world's rivers and lakes have 4.4 tons per person per day of water, 4,400 liters. And even if we completely used all of that, well, we're already using 1.6 tons, so that we would be using an additional 2.8 tons. We would be draining all of the world's rivers, except for in inaccessible places. We would be draining all the world's. We would be using all the water from the world's lakes. Then we would have an extra 2.8 tons to give to our crops and pastures, 2,800 liters per person per day. And this is in addition to the 6 tons that our crops and pastures already have from rainwater. So let's say that again. The land that we harvest from already gets 6 tons of rainwater, of precipitation, and the best we could do, even if we drained everything, would be to give it another 2.8, another 3. We could increase the amount of water on our cropland and pastures by 50%. So that already gives you an idea that we aren't going to be able to double our harvest by feeding water to our cropland. In fact, it's hard to imagine increasing our, already withdrawing the amount that we do, 1.6 tons out of 4.4. We have a huge impact on the world's rivers and wetlands, and it's hard to imagine taking even one more ton, making a 60% increase in our withdrawals. It was 2.6 tons would be just over half of the water in the world's lakes and rivers and aquifers. And it would maybe somebody would be willing to think about doing that, but already our rivers are and our lakes are nothing like what they would be if we weren't already withdrawing the 1.4 tons, 1.6 tons. If we withdrew another ton of water per person per day, it would just be, as far as I can tell, it would be a nightmare. So you can debate whether we want to do that or not. I suspect that we don't. So overall, what I'm trying to say is maybe we could add, by rerouting water, by taking more water from the rivers and the ponds and lakes, we could maybe increase our harvest by tens of percents, 10, 20, 30%, but there's no chance that we could increase our harvest by doubling it. The amount of water on offer is not enough to double our harvest. Now, so overall, the bottom line is we can increase our harvest some by taking more water, but we can't increase it that much. Remember, doublings are what we really want. We've been doubling every 22 years, and we would like to have another doubling and another doubling. And this is telling us that, a 30% increase in our water supply, in our crop harvest from water, which that's the amount that our economy our consumption grows in 7, 8, 9 years. So it's not much. But with all that said, I want to say irrigation done in specific places could have a big impact not on our total harvest, but enough impact to really change many people's lives. There's a paper published in a scientific paper published in 2018 that estimated it examined in what parts of the world our cropland being limited by not having enough water. So they had some data and some models, and they tried to figure out all around the world which bits of cropland actually could do better if they had more water. And then if that cropland, if that cropland would benefit enough from more water, then they said, okay, this cropland. So if it would only make a 10% increase in the harvest, then probably you wouldn't bother to irrigate it. But if it would make a big difference in the harvest, say a 50% increase, then probably you would irrigate it. And this paper, so with their data and their models, they estimated, okay, where would we start irrigating based on where would the harvest increase if we irrigated, and then and then how much would the harvest increase. So they looked into two scenarios. One is just you irrigate everywhere that you can make the harvest increase, and they found that if we did that, we could increase our harvest from our cropland by 1,800 calories per person per day. They didn't really like this option very much. They called it unsustainable. But still, first of all, that gives you, again, our total harvest from our cropland is 15,000 calories per person per day. This paper estimated that we could get a 1,800 calorie increase, which is a little more than 10% of our current harvest. And also 1,800 calories per person per day is almost enough to meet our basic calorie requirement. So if you used all of that harvest just to feed us, not our cattle and stuff, then it could make a big difference for keeping people alive or keeping them well fed. So they didn't like this option, the 1,800 calorie increase option, because they called it unsustainable, and because they thought that taking this much in some regions of the world, it was fine, but in some regions of the world it was taking unsustainable levels of water. What did they mean by that? They meant that the rivers were going dry that wouldn't otherwise be dry. They meant that people are draining aquifers, so they're taking water out from underground that is not being replaced. So after some hundreds of years or decades, whatever, they wouldn't be able to get the water from the aquifer anymore. And the third one is that they were disallowing the possibility of long distance transport of water, say thousands of kilometers. So they weren't thinking about moving water for very long distances. And when you exclude those possibilities, then you get a scenario called sustainable, what they called sustainable, and that meant, again, keep water in the rivers so they don't get too low, and meant don't take more water out of the aquifers than is going in, and don't move water very long distances. And they said if you did that, and if you canceled out, you stopped doing all the irrigation that they consider unsustainable that's happening already, and you start doing irrigation elsewhere where there is enough water, then they said still you could get an extra 800 calories per person per day in this sustainable scenario. Okay, and in particular in that scenario, they said that Africa today doesn't irrigate much at all, and they said that Africa could double its harvest by starting to irrigate. Not all of Africa, just certain zones of Africa where irrigation would help, and so in that extra it would be such a large increase. It would be more than doubling Africa's grain harvest yearly, and so it could help Africa feed itself. yeah, Africa it doesn't irrigate, and it doesn't use much fertilizer, and it does have some difficulty feeding itself. It does rely to some extent on grain imports, and if Africa were able to double its calorie production, it might well be able to feed itself. Um, so so what I'm saying is we can expect by rerouting our water from our ponds and our rivers and our lakes and our aquifers, we can expect increases in our harvest of 10%, 20%, 30%, and those increases are still significant. 10% of 15,000 is 1,500 calories per person per day, almost enough to meet the worldwide calorie consumption if we ate only grains. Okay. Of course, we also want to eat some other things, but it's a huge difference, but not enough to supply an extra factor of 2 in our in energy consumption. So that's it for using the world's rivers and lakes. Now we come to the second option, which is desalination. That means when you take seawater, which has salt in it, you purify it to take out the salt and you use it to irrigate. The reason why you have to purify it is because just like if you were to drink seawater, you would just kill yourself if you drank enough of it. Same thing if you try to water cropland with seawater, you'll kill the plants. So here are some basic physics of something called thermodynamics. There's no way to get around this physics, absolutely none. Zero possibility for it. Says that in order to remove the salt from the seawater, well, 1 ton of seawater, purifying 1 ton of seawater and removing the salt would take about 650 calories to remove that salt. That's I mean, it changes a tiny bit with the temperature. Here I'm talking about standard seawater, 35 grams of salt per liter, and 25 degrees Celsius room temperature. It changes a little bit, but it's still roughly 650 calories per ton, per 1,000 liters. Okay, so, and I'm not going to go into it, I'm just telling you there's no wiggle room here at all. It's absolutely impossible to do better than that. The best desalination plants, in other words, we don't do, that's the absolute bare minimum if you could do things absolutely perfectly, but we use real world equipment. Our best desalination plants actually use 1,300 calories per ton of water that they purify. 1,300 calories of. Now let's talk about how many calories you need because for 600 kilos of water, to purify 600 liters of water, you need 800 calories from the world's best desalination plants. Okay, and that 800 calories of water, 800 calories used to purify 600 kilos of water. If you put that on cropland, and the cropland does well, then it will give you 1 kilo of dry plant material. So 800 calories that you have to spend on purifying the water at the desalination plant in order to give you 1 kilo of dry plant material. So roughly, that dry plant material will contain 4,000 calories. So you had to spend 800 calories for purifying the water in order to get 4,000 calories from your crop. Now, actually, the expense is higher than 800 calories because that's just the expense of running the plant, of the energy that you have to put in to keep the plant running and purifying. You also have to construct the plant, you have to maintain the plant, you have to construct and maintain the irrigation system, the canals for moving water in from the sea to wherever you're doing the farming, also all the energy that the farms and the farmers use. Okay, so the actual energy expense of producing those 4,000 calories of dry plant material will be a lot higher than 800 calories. So this is really not, it could easily be 4,000 calories for all of the infrastructure and all the work. Okay, So this is really a no-go. What I'm trying to say in these couple minutes for desalination is it's really not a workable way of harvesting energy. You can't make a return on the energy invested. It's just the amount that you have to spend on the desalination and the equipment and all the labor and all the canals, and then also on the farming, all those easily add up to a large fraction or all of the 4,000 calories that you're going to get from the dry plant material. This is not a workable way of harvesting. It's very small profit margin, if any, and therefore it's very precarious. It's not a good bet. And then another problem that makes things even worse is it's not something that individual people can innovate with. You can't have a farmer doing it on his own because it's a huge scale thing. You have to move the water probably hundreds of kilometers from the sea to wherever it needs to go, and you have to build a big desalination plant and all the rest. Okay, so this is absolutely no-go, desalination as a way of harvesting energy, harvesting more energy from the sun. However, if you have energy to spare, then desalination can be a way of producing food. So as long as you have extra energy, sure, go for broke. Farm your desert. But actually, I have doubts about that. Why not just ship your food in from somewhere else where there is water anyway? So we've covered the possibility of obtaining water from the world's rivers and lakes and feeding it to our cropland. We've covered the second possibility, which is purifying salt water, and now we come to the third possibility, which I think is the most promising one for helping our crops. And that's to help the land make better use of the water that it uses. And the way you would do this is locally. You would do it with small pieces of cropland. Okay. By the way, I'm not going to discuss here, I have already discussed this and I'll come to it very soon, changes that you can make to the soil, okay, and how you can improve the soil so it absorbs water better and helps plants better. I'm going to talk about what you can do instead of with water flows. So what you do is you would look at pretty small tracts of land, maybe tens of meters on a side or hundreds of meters of a side, a small farm. If you have a large farm, you would break it up into small pieces and look at those pieces and then see how they fit together. What you would be looking at is locally, you want to understand exactly where the water is flowing, okay, and where it is stored and how it is lost to your land. So, and I'm talking about water flows that are generally invisible, because what happens when it rains is you'll get a small amount of water, and it will sort of drain slowly across tens of meters before it comes to a little rivulet and then funnels into a stream. Maybe sometimes it'll go hundreds of meters before it hits a stream. Okay, so what I'm talking about is these flows across a meter, tens of meters, and so on. Very, very shallow things that you barely see, and it's hard to make out which way the water is going. But you want to know exactly which way it's going, so you understand where it accumulates, where it starts, where it goes, where it accumulates, and how it moves off your land, if it does move off your land. And you're trying to arrange for the water to stay. So for instance, often, almost always, the land after a while organizes itself in valleys and ridges. Okay, and once you have that arrangement, then water will funnel off of the ridges into valleys, okay, and then once it's in a valley, it'll move along a little streamlet or something. Maybe the streamlet is only there, or even almost, maybe it's buried under leaves, so you don't even see the water flowing, but it'll move pretty quickly off the land, off of your plot of land somewhere else. So it's concentrated and it's moving, and it moves into streams and rivers and so on. So instead of letting that happen, what you would do is you would build a little earthworks along the valley, and these earthworks get in the way of the water, and they force the water to move at right angles along, not going up, not going down, but at right angles to the stream, and so that makes it instead of rushing downhill, it goes sort of sideways, and it gives the water more time to be absorbed by your land and by more of your land. Okay, and then once it's absorbed, it sits there until plants are ready to use it. Might flow underground, but it's better. It waits longer. Okay, of course you also want to understand underground flows, but they're slower than above ground flows. And you'll build ponds along those divertments. So you're diverting the water away from the stream. You're trying to make it go sideways and into ponds so that it can be held and absorbed in the pond. And so that's just, I mean, there are other ways you can do it, but the overall idea is just to try to make the water move slowly and snake around and so on, and be absorbed, soaked up, so that later on, so that over months after rain, that water will be available to plants. Now here I'm drawing from this particular idea is talked about a lot under the header of permaculture. I'll mention that again in a little while, but just if you want to hear more about that, just go look up permaculture. And what this would require you to do though is to adjust your farm's layout to match the details of your land. You would have small patches of land with curved boundaries. You'd have and you also want to adjust the species that are growing in different parts of your farmland to take advantage of whether there's more water here or less water, and in general, because your land it's not flat, unless you come in with machinery to absolutely flatten your land. You'll have something with these ups and downs, and since you have ups and downs, you have what I'm saying is to maximize your usage of the water as it moves across those ups and downs. You'll have to adjust your land into patches, and those patches will have boundaries, and you'll so this is not a recipe for having a long stretch of corn cropland as like we have in the Midwest. In the Midwest, you would take, if you have a kilometer squared of cropland, you would first of all you would try to see where, and this is looking at see where the water is flowing, and not just through streams but at smaller scales, and you'd begin to understand better how it's organized, and then you would adjust how you grow your crops to match the lie of the land. So I think that this is actually there's a lot of water that falls on the world's land, and I'm sure that if you think intelligently about how to design your land and make it adjust to the water that's falling on it, because in the end, on average, there will be far more water falling on your land than you can irrigate with. As you know, 6 tons of water fall on our farmland and pasture land, and we can only supply a ton or 2, a ton now, and perhaps 2 tons if we really stretch our rivers. We'll have better luck if we just try to help our cropland. I mean, of course, we should irrigate when we can, but we can also work on helping the land do the best possible but that would involve looking in detail and adjusting our farmland and its contours, its shapes, and so on to the lie of the land. Okay, so that's it for water. Now we'll talk about land, and I was already talking about what we do wrong in the previous episode, and now I'll talk about what we can do right, or general directions. Okay, but I want to point out that this is a really, we have an awful lot of cropland around the world, and every bit of it is different, and it's very complicated. You know, a farmer can spend a lifetime on farming, and I'm not a farmer, but and it's not that one farmer could farm everywhere. The farmer knows his farm, and there are billions of farmers around the world, each with their own farm, and they know their farm. Okay, so I want to talk about the basic idea, and then gives pros and cons about different aspects of the basic idea that I pointed out in the previous episode was that our farming techniques, at least our large-scale mechanized farming techniques, tend to kill everything in the soil, and to make the soil disappear, and more or less treats the soil as if it were a hydroponic medium. So we have to add water and fertilizer, and also we kill the crop over and over again, once or more times per year. So the way to do better would be to let the crops and the land and the organisms in the soil grow as close to naturally as possible. Okay, so to stop killing everything in sight. Of course, we don't really want to just try to let our cropland be absolutely natural, because we know very well from the land that is not under our cultivation that we don't get much of a harvest from it. There's if you just leave land, a forest or a prairie, to itself and try to gather things from it, you'll get a tenth of or less of the harvest that we get from our cropland, because those plants, even if they're growing very well, they're not growing the stuff that we need to eat. So I've said many times already in these episodes that our cropland, our best cropland, our average cropland worldwide, even though we're using some of the world's best land for our cropland, still gives a harvest that's, and I'm talking about the total harvest, leaves, stems, and grain. The harvest from our cropland is about the same, just slightly better than the average harvest worldwide. And again, I'm talking about all the plants growing on the whole surface of the earth, including tree trunks and branches and leaves and all the rest. Okay, so I'm comparing the stuff growing on our cropland to the stuff growing on the rest of the world's land, and saying, okay, it doesn't look that good, that our cropland, even though it's some of the world's best land, only gives about the average, the same as average land worldwide. But that's a little bit of an unfair comparison, because actually, if you compare yield, like the amount of stuff that you get from it that we can eat, okay, average land worldwide gives us very little, whereas our cropland gives us a lot. So there's a reason why we treat our cropland the way we do. There's a reason why we kill the crops every season. There's a reason why we leave the land bare, and things like that. All the things that we do, there are reasons. I'm not saying that they're absolutely right, okay? I'm just saying that if you want to go to a more natural way, keep things alive because you think there will be benefits, you have to weigh those benefits against the reasons why we do the things the way we do them now, okay? So, like, for instance, I think one direction to go in is to try to not kill the ecosystem that lives in the soil and can help plants out, called the rhizosphere, okay? All the fungi and bacteria and little worms and things, okay? But there are disadvantages to this. One of them is that a common way to get more nitrogen into your soil, nitrogen is a very important fertilizer, is to grow beans, or things called legumes. And these plants, after you kill them, they release nitrogen into the soil. They harvest while they're growing. Actually, they're feeding bacteria that harvest nitrogen, and then when you kill them, they feed that nitrogen into the soil. Well, if you never kill your crop, then the nitrogen doesn't get cycled back into the soil to be useful for your harvest. Okay, so there's a plus. One is you you keep the ecosystem alive. The negative is that there are some things that don't work as well for you. You might aim for, like in many places around the for keeping many species alive in your soil, and maybe even because around the world in land that's not under our cultivation, often there are many species growing together. Okay, but the con against that, of course, is that it can be very hard to manage mixtures of species. You want to, if you want to keep your land from blowing away, then you might want to keep it always covered. That would be another reason for not killing things. Okay, so you want to keep something always growing on your land, but there's a downside there too, because if when you leave land always things always growing on it, and you never kill the crop, then as long as there's green stuff growing on your land, it will be using water. And it will tend to use all the water that it's given. So that means that in a year with less water, you'll get less of a harvest. So you'll have unpredictable harvests depending on whether you have a rainy year or a dry year. Whereas if you do normal cropping, or you grow your crop for 4 months and then you harvest, then it probably uses a large fraction of the water, but it's not quite as sensitive to there being a dry year. You might want to have plants that their roots grow deep. Okay, so this would be something you would aim for, and I think these are all ideas that I'm saying we want to aim for, but I'm also trying to tell you cons, because I'm trying to emphasize that for every single one, this whole direction that you take, the overall direction is trying to move towards keeping things alive in your soil, keeping things more like how they are when we're not farming, so that the soil will be healthier and everything growing on the soil will be healthier. But all of them have cons, so you have to balance them, and this balancing will be done in individual farms and individual regions depending on the circumstances. So you will want roots to grow deeper than they do now with our crops. Okay, but if they grow deeper, that the deeper roots means the plant has to spend more energy on growing roots and less on producing grain. Okay, you also want a vibrant ecosystem in the soil, but part of that vibrant ecosystem could be pests that destroy your harvest, right? So you have to think about that. You want to control the ecosystem in some way, make sure that's helping your plants out instead of destroying them. Okay. So overall, the goal here the direction we would have to take in order to get better harvests than we get now is to move away from this mass agriculture, farms that are kilometers on a side and where everything's killed off every season. Okay, but this always has to be balanced against the need to get a crop and get a significant crop, and all these considerations that drove our choices to make the land the way it is now. So let me give you one idea that people have been using, and I'm going to mention many ideas, but I won't be going into them as much. I'll give two ideas in some detail, and then some other ideas in less detail. This idea is no-till agriculture. So with no-till, and by the way, this is actually widely accepted. About a quarter of the United States farmland uses no-till agriculture, also for growing grains and things. And in the no-till means you never turn the soil over. You leave roots and stems in place when you harvest, and then you make cuts in the land. When you want to plant, you make cuts in the land, you drop seeds into the cut, then you let the cut come back together, and then you wait for the seeds to grow. But of course, since you've just cut the land, you haven't removed things around the land, around the cut, you have to keep other things from growing besides your seeds. So the way that's usually done is with pesticides and herbicides, things to control the plant's herbicides. So basically you kill everything on the land still using herbicides, and then you plant your seeds and let them grow in the cuts. And this can reduce the erosion on your land to be comparable to how fast the soil is being replenished, so you're not actually losing land. In the previous episode I talked about how we're losing land at a rate of average worldwide of maybe 2 millimeters per year, and this would, with no-till, that basically there's no loss. You're able to replenish the land as fast as it erodes. But there are of course some disadvantages. One is that our herbicides, you can be sure that our weeds will develop resistances to the chemicals that we use, and sooner or later our chemicals won't be so effective. Okay, and then also this cutting and all the rest and applying herbicides takes some energy, and building the machines and running them across the farmland. And then if the herbicides weren't working for you anymore, or if you didn't have enough fuel to run the machines, then doing this all by hand, doing a no-till agriculture by hand, would require a lot of work. You'd have to spend a lot of time killing off plants other than the ones that you're trying to grow. So that's some disadvantages. Like I'm gonna say this again. Everything that could be an improvement, like this one, can end erosion. No-till can end erosion. It also has some disadvantages. So you might want to go part way towards it. So you say you want to reduce erosion, and by doing something where you do till, but you till thin strips through your land, and you keep some part, so the thin strip may be 10 or 20 centimeters wide. You till that, you plant in that, then the plant can grow relatively weed-free for a while, and hopefully will outcompete the stuff that is left untilled. And that way you get erosion that's faster than replenishment. So you're still eroding, but it's slower. So there are pros and cons, and you don't need to go all the way for any of these. Now let me talk about, so that was no-till. That's one direction you could go in. Another idea you could pursue is perennials. So just to lay out what is an annual is a plant that dies every year. So many of the plants that we grow, such as wheat, they're guaranteed to die at the end of the year, or when we kill them. A perennial is something that keeps going from year to year, like an apple tree would be an example of a perennial. But there are also things other than trees that are perennials. There are plenty of things that you can see growing, that vines and so on, that don't die from year to year. So the idea then would be, a perennial has the advantage that if you could get it to give you a harvest every year, then you wouldn't have to cut it down and tear out the land and plow the land every year. The land could grow relatively untouched. So in the ecosystem in the soil could grow, and everything, it would be so much better, right? So the idea here is to grow grains that, because most of our calories come from grains, to grow grains that keep giving grain every season after season. So you do harvest the grain every season. You cut the stalks, you cut the grain off, but you leave the base of the plant there, and the base of the plant regrows in the next season and produces more grain. That's the idea of a perennial grain. Okay, and as it stands, at least until a few years ago, we didn't have any good perennial grains. But we've done a lot of breeding. Every crop that we grow today is the fruit of a lot of breeding. So if we were to breed for perennial grains, perhaps there's a chance that we could get a good perennial grain, something like wheat or rice or corn, that we wouldn't have to plow the land under every season. I think first I'll talk about two examples of grains that have been developed recently, and then I'll talk about pros and cons of the general idea. Okay. One is there is a kind of wheat that's been developed in the last couple of decades called intermediate wheat, or there's a brand name associated with it. It's Kernza, okay, it's actually being grown on farms and being mixed into breads and sold. And Kernza is something a lot like wheat, and it is a perennial. It'll grow year after year. Okay, but the problem with Kernza, with this intermediate wheat, is that the first year that it grows, it delivers about 1/5, somewhere around a fifth of the harvest that normal wheat would deliver on the same land. So you are getting some grain, but it's just a very small fraction of the grain that you would get from normal wheat. That's as this Kernza stands today. And then the second year, the harvest is even less. It might be 1/10 or less of the normal harvest from wheat. So it gets worse the second year and the third year and so on. So if you want calories from your land, you aren't going to grow Kernza as it stands right now. On the other hand, we're only maybe 20 years into the breeding program for Kernza, and we can presume that the wheat and the rice and the corn that we have today are the fruits of thousands of years of breeding that went on sometimes a long time ago, before we were keeping track of these things. But certainly all these species that we use today are the fruit of an awful lot, many centuries probably of breeding. So 20 years in to breeding Kernza is not a long time, and maybe if we have another 20 years or another 50 years, maybe we'll get harvests from Kernza that continue year after year, and that are competitive with wheat. So that would be, at that point, we could start planting Kernza instead of wheat. Now there's another one that's more encouraging, perhaps. Rice, many breeds of rice that are used today. And now remember, rice grows under somehow more friendly circumstances than one usually grows wheat under. It's on very flat land, and you make sure that it has plenty of water all the time. And it's in tropical regions, so warm regions. So those are things that rice has advantages over wheat. Life is easier for rice, okay? And the breeds that we have, many of the breeds that we have of rice, if you just cut the rice plant to the base and harvest the rice, and you let it stay there for another season, it will grow more rice, okay? That's called ratooning, where you don't kill it, you don't plow it under, you allow it to grow for a second season. It'll give you more rice. It'll give you a bit less rice, maybe 80%, 3/4 of the amount that you got from the first season. And that's probably why people generally don't leave it for the second season. They generally plow it under and grow another crop, because they want a full harvest from each crop. But some people have done some breeding recently, starting in China, where they bred standard farming varieties of rice with some wild rice, and they were able to get a crop, a breed of rice that grows. They've grown it 2 seasons per year for 4 years, and for those 8 seasons, on the same farm, it delivered a good harvest, about the same as normal rice would, and it didn't go down from year to year. It in fact, it was almost exactly the same as normal rice would have. So there's apparently no disadvantage in terms of less rice, and there's no disadvantage in the harvest going down year, but it's not going down season to season. So they've developed a perennial rice, and by now it's been grown in many different countries, in Uganda and all through Southeast Asia and Iran, and in many provinces of China, many thousands of farms. We now have perennial rice. So it's possible, okay? Rice has some special advantages, which may be the reason why it works for rice better than for wheat, but we don't know. We haven't bred wheat that long yet. Now, as for why you would want to do perennials instead of, let's talk about pros and cons again, why you would want to do perennials instead of annuals, why you would want to have plants that will grow back cereals, grains that will grow back year after year, instead of, and why you think that they might do better. Well, I said why you'd want to, because you don't have to kill the soil and leave it exposed. But there are reasons why you might think that they would do better. Well, let's say, let me back up a minute. We chose annual crops. Here are some of the advantages of crops that you kill every season. One is that they grow quickly. You choose species that grow quickly. They've grown to maturity and given you seeds after 4 months. The harvesting is simple. If you plant a whole field full of rice, you just go through on the same day and you harvest the whole field. And then they're easy to breed, because again you have a whole field full of this stuff, and you plant it with one breed, and then you see how that breed does, and if you like this breed better than the breed that goes in the plot next to you, then the next season you take the rice from your plot and you plant it in the next plot over. You know what you're dealing with, and also these annuals, these things that grow for 4 months and then give you their grain, because they can only reproduce themselves through grain, that they give their all to that grain. At the end of in the last month, while the grain is in the last month as the grain is growing, the plant takes everything that it can from its stalks and leaves. It robs its stalks and leaves of everything that it can and puts it in the grain, including like 70% of the nitrogen and almost half of the energy that's embodied in the rest of the plant. If you notice, at the end of a growing season, the leaves and the stem of a corn plant or a wheat plant feel a lot more flimsy than they did a month or two earlier. That's because so much of their mass has gone into the grain. Okay, but all of these advantages meant that we were basically, the crops that we're most interested in are basically weeds. Okay, our grain, our corn, our wheat, our rice, they're all basically weeds. They're things that are like they're nature's emergency workers. They're good at getting into a situation where there was a disaster and growing very quickly, and then later other plants will move in and take over. They're emergency workers. They're weeds. Okay, and weeds are not the best for, they're quick reaction things. They get into emergencies and they do something. They do it quickly, and then they've produced their seed and move on. Okay, they're not the best for resilience. Okay, or for protecting themselves, and they're not and they're not the best for long-term productivity. They're short-term oriented, and they're not good at soil growth or the ecosystem. Okay, so those are reasons to think that we might that perennials might do better than our annuals, because perennials know how to, perennials know how to take care of themselves and build a situation that works for them long term, and annuals just know how to take advantage of an advantageous situation and do it very quickly. Okay, but there's a problem with perennials, not just that they're harder to control and harder to breed and so on, and that. But one particular problem is that, of course, a perennial is interested in living long term, living longer than a year, and so it's not going to throw its all into the grain. It's going to keep some back for its roots and for keeping itself going until the next season. So in general, you would expect to get less from your perennial, unless your perennial just is a lot healthier than your annual, unless it has managed to harvest a lot more sunlight than your annual and has and in general, if you take a perennial that's harvested 1 kilo of dry plant material and compare it to an annual that's harvested the same kilo of dry plant material, 4,000 calories each, and then you think about how much of that how much of that you're likely to be able to harvest as grain, you would expect that the perennial would give you less, because the perennial is busy trying to think how to live longer, while the annual is thinking about how to put all of its energy and all of its resources into grain so that that grain will grow the next year. So again, there's a pro and a con for perennials. And there are reasons to think that they might be a good idea and that they might be a poor idea. Okay. So I just want to list briefly some other ideas that you might that people do think about for improving their farmland. You can make your own compost in your own farm and then feed your land with that compost. Another idea is you can try to add organisms to the soil to make it. So these are ideas you can do even while plowing your land under and doing other. What I'm saying is you can plow your land under. You can leave it exposed half of the year during the winter or whatever, and still you can compost it. You don't have to do everything perfectly or implement all the best practices at once, and I don't think it's wise to do that. You do what works on your land in your particular situation as well as you can figure out. Okay. So you could try to improve the ecosystem by growing some liquid full of bacteria somewhere, sort of like the idea of probiotic drinks that are supposed to improve what's going on in our stomach. Similarly, you can grow some sort of probiotic drink for the land, pour it over the land, and then it'll have extra bacteria and stuff that will help plants grow. Hopefully, people do this, and there are many different recipes for these things that you'll pour into the land. You can do while your plant, after you've harvested your main crop, say wheat, then in the off season you can grow something else, maybe alfalfa or something, or maybe a mixture of species, and that will keep the land covered more of the time, and also may help the two species, even though they're not growing at the same time, may help each other out. Similarly, you can do a crop rotation where you plant one crop one year and another crop the next year, and they can help each other out. You can also do grazing. There's some crops that allow you to have grazers on the land as the crop is growing, but probably more often you would do it in rotation. You would grow your crop one year and then you would have it grazed the next year. You can also, some plants repel insects, so you could grow some, and so you could grow a plant that if there's a plant that is vulnerable to certain insects, like broccoli is really vulnerable to certain insects, and if you're not careful, it'll just get eaten alive and turn into mush. So you might grow next to the broccoli, you might grow something else that repels that kind of insect, something that the insects don't like, and then they may not eat the broccoli. so these are all ideas that you could pursue. They all have advantages and disadvantages. They may work in one place and not in another. But yeah, so and I think increasingly we'll be looking at breeds that are adapted. Already we have breeds that are adapted to certain regions, like hundreds of kilometers wide. But I think as we improve, as we try to get better and better harvests, probably smaller regions, tens of kilometers, or even particular farms may have specific breeds of, say, pears, that this farm's breed of pears, and it seems to do well here on this farm and may not do so well for our neighbor. So every farm might have its own breed of rice or corn eventually. I'm not saying right now, but we may move in that direction, and as we try to get better and better harvests from particular pieces of land. Each piece of land is different, and so you can't expect that the same breed that does well on this particular farm will be the optimal breed on another farm. So in fact, in general, I think we'll be, even on a farm, you'll look at how the land is laid out, and what kind of soil there is, where the water's going, and you'll grow different things on different parts of that land. So I expect that in order to get better and better harvests, we'll be looking at more and more detail at our land and in bits of land, and trying to adapt ourselves to each piece of land to see what is the best way to get a harvest from that land. And very individualized attention, and a thing like a corn farm that's a kilometer on a side will look, well, it'll look picturesque, but it won't look like the best solution anymore. I think I do need to spend a little time talking about fertilizers before I finish up this discussion. I think people ask, will we need to use fertilizers in the future? Suppose you use perennials, so you never have to plow the land and so on. And I think we may need less fertilizer if we allow a vibrant ecosystem in the soil, and try to allow the plants to work well with whatever's in the soil. The better, if we think a little more carefully about what we plant, then we may need less fertilizer, and in some cases we may need no fertilizer at all. But my feeling is that first of all, the fact is fertilizer is needed for a reason. If you don't have, well, the big three are nitrogen, phosphorus that comes in phosphate rock, and potassium, which comes in potash. Those are the three main ingredients that you need for nutrients. Then there are some other ones like iron. If you don't have those nutrients in the soil, the plant won't grow. And it's not always clear that even if you have a thriving soil with all the organisms and stuff, it's not at all clear on many kinds of soil that you'll have enough fertilizer. You might enough nutrients for your plants to produce grain. You might have a fifth of what's needed. You need all three of those, and then so a typical farmland today, grain farmland or soybeans today, might need 150 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per 100 meters squared of land. Okay, 40 kilos of potassium and 30 kilograms of phosphorus. So you have to, if you don't supply nutrients in roughly those amounts, you aren't going to get your full crop. So that you can have crops that are limited by not having enough sunlight. You can have crops that are limited by not having enough water, and you can also have crops that are limited by not having enough nutrients. And you have to feed them. If those nutrients, you can try as well as you can, as hard as you can, to help the soil provide as many nutrients for your plants as you can. But sometimes, fairly often, probably they won't produce as many nutrients as those plants can use. especially if you're content to get 1 ton per year of grain from your farmland instead of 5. You say, okay, I'll just deal with one ton, and I'll live with that, or per hectare. Then, or in other words, 100 grams per square meter instead of 500 grams per square meter. You sure you can then maybe you don't need those fertilizers, but in many places, if you want to get the 5 tons instead of the ton, you'll want to feed it fertilizer. And then people worry about whether how much energy is being used to produce the fertilizer that our land uses. That we do use a lot of fertilizer. Well, not a lot actually, compared to the amount of water that we go through on our farmland. A little fertilizer goes a long way. So let's see. Per person per day, we use 82 grams of nitrogen, of ammonia. Ammonia contains nitrogen. 82 grams per person per day. Compare that to the tons of water that we go through in a day. Okay, and in that 82 grams of nitrogen that we go through per person per day worldwide is about 600. Takes about 600 calories per person per day to produce that ammonia. Which 600 calories is significant, but but consider that our cropland is growing somewhere around 10,000 calories per person per day. It's a percentage of the amount that we get back by throwing nitrogen on the cropland. So I don't think, another way of saying it is that if we just take the crop that we grow and we burn a small fraction of it, we'll have enough energy to get more nitrogen from the air. So I think it is a concern. The energy consumption of nitrogen of our fertilizer is a concern, but it's not a deal breaker. It's not our, it's really not a deal breaker. And then the other two, that's nitrogen. Nitrogen, you basically have to get it from the air and spend some energy to do that. But the other two big ones are potash and phosphate. That's potassium and phosphorus. And we mine those, and mining is not terribly energy consuming. And transporting large bulk materials is not terribly large consumption of energy either. So it's not a lot of energy to get the potash and the phosphate that our land needs. And also there are plentiful supplies. The United States estimates, the Geological Survey estimates that there's enough for 100 years of potash and enough for 300 years of phosphate. That's the amount that we know about right now that we can make a profit on mining and selling. Okay, then that's the amount that's profitable mines right now. So we have enough for 100 years. That's at least both, and then the amount that we know about that doesn't seem like it would be profitable at today's prices is many times as large as that. So, and when you see a number like a profitable amount that can be mined at a profitable level, and that number is larger than 50 years, you know that there's no end in sight, because we're going to keep on finding more of it as we go on. When we're continually finding more of everything, and also, so we're nowhere near running through these amounts, these fertilizers. The energy cost is not huge compared to how much we get back in energy in our crops. And so I think if you can, do without. there are ways to improve your farming techniques to use less fertilizer, but and also don't think that we're all going to starve to death if we I don't think we're going to, what I'm saying is I don't think we're going to run out of fertilizer, but even if we did, we're not going to all starve to death. People talk about that, but the fact is that we have around 10,000 calories of, I forget if it's 8,000 or 9,000 of that grows on our cropland and our pastures, and most of that is actually we use as fodder for our animals. So we could, if we stop, I mean, if in a bad year or a bad decade we didn't have enough to feed our animals, and we'd eat some animals, and we'd have much fewer animals for a little while, but there's no, as long as we, we could live with 1/5 the amount of grain that the amount of stuff coming from our cropland that we have right now, probably 1/5. It would be a very uncomfortable year, a very uncomfortable decade, and we'd have worries about nutrition and stuff. But if we happen to have the self-control to make sure that grain was partitioned equally between each of the inhabitants of the human race, we wouldn't starve. The real problem is that the real thing that would cause starvation is not the amount of grain. We are oversupplied with grain. The real thing that would cause starvation is if we chose to feed our cattle instead of people, or if we chose to give more to some people instead of others, which are likely. Sure, there would be famines. I'm just saying it wouldn't be because of the lack of fertilizer. Fertilizer would be a contributing factor. The main thing would be how we'd be distributing our food, who and what we would be choosing to feed with our grain. That's the real thing. So I think talking about fertilizer will result in mass starvation it really exasperates me. What will cause our starvation is what we do. Okay, so I'll try to wind up quickly now. There are so many movements and methodologies that have been invented for. I just mentioned a few ideas, and different movements and ideologies combine them in various combinations, and so there's like something called agroecology, there's regenerative agriculture, there's holistic management, organic farming, permaculture, biodynamic farming, and then there are lots of ones that are less famous, like Korea has at least one of its own, India has at least 4. There's something called the system of rice intensification that's focused on rice, and that's been used in many places around the world. And each of these, can keep you busy for a lifetime studying and implementing and so on. They just combine any of these, some selection of, and some. And I think they're all very interesting and very worthwhile pursuing. And the lucky thing is that there are billions of us on this planet, and so there are plenty of people to try different options and develop them custom, tailor-made to your own farmland. Okay, and I don't expect any single approach or even a few dominant approaches. We'll tailor our, if we want to really improve our harvest, we'll tailor our farming to each situation, each farm, and what the needs are there. Overall, what I'm saying is that there needs to be a change of attitude. Okay, so I'm not recommending a particular plan like permaculture, that one has interested me, or say agroecology or organic farming, and I'm not saying any of them. I think each of them has their pros and cons, and you have to look at what are the advantage of this compared to conventional farming, and what's the best for you on this land. But overall, I think the attitude is you need to I think when you raise your land yearly or seasonally and you insist on a single species, you're acting a lot like a lord who's just bossing people around and doesn't know anything about the people he's working with. maybe knows something, but it's very much top down. And I think the attitude we need towards our land is something a lot more like the way a well-trained dog works with his master, that the master's in charge certainly, but they're watching each other all the time, they're communicating, and they're walking together. I'm not talking about a conventional pet owner where the dog sort of pulls the owner along on a leash, right? I'm talking about well-trained dogs, okay, where they are really in constant communication and know their way around each other, and one's responding to the other. The master is responding to the dog, and the dog is responding to the master. It's not top down, and I think that's the way we should be with our land. You need to engage with your land. You have to be ready to learn about it, be teachable and attentive, give it more care. You have to be ready to adapt to it, to what it's best at. You have to see what it's best at, what's working well and what's not, even if you don't understand the reason, and be responsive, okay? What I'm calling for is like an intimacy with your land. You're helping it, you're helping the ecosystem, you're trying to help each species know what's going on in it, try to understand what's in the soil. And this will all go it takes a lot of learning, a lot of thought, and it's not going to be obvious to you after some education or after a year on your land. Things are going to be revealed to you from experience as you work on the land. So be careful, slow, thoughtful work, and you'll see opportunities come up after 5 years or after 20 years that you didn't think of originally, and then you'll go in a different direction with your farming than you would have at the start. So I think in order to get better from our land, we'll be working at a small scale, and we'll be focused on each piece of land and what that's best at, and we won't be doing so many of these large fields with large machines, because when you run over a large field, a kilometer squared, you just don't have time to look at the land in detail and understand what's the best for it. You're treating it as if it were all the same. So this will take a long time to do. So I'm finally ready to summarize. So I think that after a century or two of this kind of work, very detailed, very responsive to the land and to the specifics of the land, trying to work with it, and the organisms on it to see how they can work together to give a better harvest. In the ecosystems and so on, I think there's some possibility with this kind of very detailed work all across the world that we could increase our harvest of food, fodder, and wood by a factor of 2. I think we could increase it there's some possibility we could increase it from 15,000 calories per person per day to 30,000 calories per person per day. Now, bear in mind that this isn't a sure thing at all. First, it would be the way that we're eroding our land and degrading our land today. It will already be an achievement if we manage to not reduce our harvest. If our harvest doesn't go down from 15,000 to some lower number over the next 100 years, that will be an achievement already. Okay, but I'm saying it could be possible that by detailed work on the land, like I'm describing, and lots of personal experience by billions of people around the world, that we could actually increase the harvest significantly. But just by a factor of 2. I'm not saying much more than that. And why do I think a factor of 2? Why only a doubling? Okay. Well, as I said in the previous episode about genetics and about breeding, about changing the internals of plants, it looked like there 40%, 10% in 40 years probably shouldn't even expect that much. That would be hard just with genetics and breeding. Now we can do better by helping the land out with the sort of intensive, very, very local attention that I've been talking about in this episode. I think we can do, that'll give us more of a payoff than breeding and genetic work. But still, I think getting a 10% increase in our harvest per decade would be doing well. and there's not that much room for going past it, doubling ever. Why? Because inside of plants, as I've discussed in previous episodes, right now the energy loss inside of a plant is 1 out of 20 calories, and even in an absolutely perfect world where everything worked absolutely perfect inside of cells, and there are millions of things to go wrong inside of a cell, all of those things, anyway, in a perfect world, the best you could do would be 1 out of 20, 1 out of 10 calories. So instead of 1 out of 20 today, 1 out of 10 in a lab. That's in a perfect world, but since we aren't in a perfect world, the best increase you could get by changing what happens in a lab is 10 or 20 or 30%. It's not a doubling, okay? Most of the factor of 2 improvement that we could get would be by what we do for the land and the water, okay? And there we know that there's a factor of 5 difference between the best land and the average land. So we'll never make all the world's land be the same as the world's best land today. We can be sure we'll never get that factor of 5. Okay, but maybe we could get a factor of 2, okay, by doing the sorts of things I've been describing and by putting a lot of work into it on a lot of land. Maybe we do breeding or genetic editing for specific breeds adapted to specific pieces of land, and so on, whatever, but it would be a lot of work, everything we could think of, to help each plot of land do the best it can. We'd be very focused on the specifics of the species, and the ecosystems and so on, and this would go on for generations. This would not be this of learning about the land, of developing better species, better farming techniques in different regions, on different farms. As each farm finds its way, and we would learn slowly, but over a century or two, perhaps we could learn a lot. So this would require a large fraction of our population to really invest in the land. It would be a lot of effort. But if we do the sorts of things I've been describing, in other words, the pendulum has swung towards a mechanized, large-scale kind of farming where we do the same thing over large expanses of land, and we basically kill everything in the soil, and we treat it more or less as like a cheap version of a greenhouse, okay, and doing economies of scale and so on. And I think if we take the pendulum back in the other direction, not entirely forgetting about what we've learned going this way, not throwing out entirely, but we just figure out what we can do by taking advantage of, by looking at individual pieces of land, of the organisms in them, and seeing how they can work together better, then that would take a lot of work, but we could get there's a chance we could get a factor of 2 improvement in our harvest, and could go from 15,000 calories per person today to 30,000 calories per person per day. So that's pretty much it for this episode. In the next one, I'll be talking more about what that effort would look like, and the morality, whether we should do that or not, intervene in the land in the way that I've been outlining it. And so anyway, that's it for this episode. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you a wonderful week, and keep coming back.